Lieutenant Rachel Thomas sat behind the wheel of her unmarked police car, her eyes scanning the streets ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished buildings of one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. It was her first day at this new precinct, a place known for its manicured lawns, grand houses, and predominantly white population. Rachel had earned her promotion through hard work and sacrifice. As a black woman in law enforcement, she knew she would face scrutiny, skepticism, and perhaps even hostility. But she wasn't afraid. She'd faced prejudice before and risen above it every time. Her mind drifted back to her previous precinct where she'd built a reputation as a tough but fair officer. Some of her former colleagues had become like family. Now, she wondered how things would be different here. As she neared the precinct, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The streets became cleaner, the cars more expensive, and the people walking on the sidewalks were dressed in fine clothes. Rachel noticed cautious glances from pedestrians, some quick, others lingering longer than necessary. She could almost hear their thoughts. What is she doing here? She'd encountered these looks before, and they never failed to leave a sour taste in her mouth. Even with her uniform on, people judged her based on the color of her skin. She shook off the uncomfortable feeling and turned her focus back to the road. The precinct came into view, a modern state-of-the-art facility that stood out against the backdrop of elegant homes. She pulled into the parking lot where a few squad cars were already parked. Several white officers stood nearby, chatting among themselves. Their conversation seemed to stop as she pulled in, and she could feel their eyes on her. Taking a deep breath, Rachel mentally prepared herself. "You've earned this, Rachel. You belong here just as much as anyone else," she whispered to herself. She stepped out of her car, smoothing out the creases in her navy blue uniform. Despite the weight of their stares, she chose to ignore them. She was there to do her job, and nothing would intimidate her. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of chill, but Rachel felt warm under the golden hour sunlight filtering through the trees. Her short, curly hair framed her face perfectly, catching the light in soft highlights. She wore a confident expression, her brown eyes sharp and determined. Her boots clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance, each step echoing her resolve. Inside the sleek precinct, polished floors gleamed under bright fluorescent lights. High-tech equipment lined the walls, creating an aura of efficiency and professionalism. Rachel approached the front desk, where a young officer looked up from his computer. "Lieutenant Rachel Thomas," she announced firmly, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of activity. "I'm here to see Captain Williams." The officer nodded but hesitated for a moment, sizing her up. "I'll let him know you're here, Lieutenant," he finally said, picking up the phone. As she waited, Rachel glanced around the room, noticing a few more officers in the lobby glancing in her direction and then quickly looking away. She could feel it, the unease, the judgment, the quiet resistance. She knew she would have to prove herself again, not just as a capable officer but as someone who could lead and be respected despite the color of her skin. Captain Williams approached, a tall middle-aged man with a stern expression. "Welcome to the precinct, Lieutenant. I trust your drive was pleasant." His tone was courteous but reserved. Rachel shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Captain. Yes, the drive was fine." They walked through the precinct, and Rachel noticed the way some officers stiffened at her presence, their eyes following her as she passed. She could sense the tension building like a thick cloud hanging in the air. Reaching the captain's office, Williams closed the door behind them. "Let me be honest with you, Lieutenant Thomas," he began, taking a seat behind his desk. "There's been some concern from the team about having a new lieutenant, especially one with a reputation like yours." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "A reputation for getting the job done?" Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I've heard you're not afraid to challenge the status quo," to stand up against corruption. That's commendable, but not everyone here sees it that way. There's a certain culture in this precinct. It's not perfect, but it works. Some of the officers are worried you might disrupt that. Rachel finished for him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Exactly. Williams hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'm not saying it's right, but I want you to be prepared for some pushback. You're going to have to earn their trust. I've never shied away from a challenge, Captain, Rachel replied steadily. I'm here to do my job and do it well. I've dealt with resistance before, and I'll deal with it again if I have to. The captain studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. I hope you mean that. Walking toward the entrance, Rachel couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. Didn't know we were getting a new lieutenant, one of them said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Yeah, and certainly not her, another added with a slight chuckle, making a point that she didn't belong. Her jaw tightened. She'd heard it all before, the subtle remarks, the quiet laughs, the unspoken sentiment that she didn't fit in. Pushing open the heavy glass door, she stepped inside the sleek precinct with polished floors, bright lights, and a high-tech reception area. It was impressive, no doubt about it. Approaching the front desk, a young officer looked up from his computer. Lieutenant Rachel Thomas, she announced, her voice firm and professional. I'm here to see Captain Williams. The officer nodded but hesitated for a moment, sizing her up. I'll let him know you're here, Lieutenant, he finally said, picking up the phone. As she waited, Rachel glanced around the room, noticing a few more officers in the lobby glancing in her direction and then quickly looking away. She could feel it, the unease, the judgment, the quiet resistance. She knew she would have to prove herself again, not just as a capable officer but as someone who could lead and be respected despite the color of her skin. Captain Williams approached, a tall middle-aged man with a stern expression. Welcome to the precinct, Lieutenant. I trust your drive was pleasant. His tone was courteous but reserved. Rachel shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Captain. Yes, the drive was fine. They walked through the precinct, and Rachel noticed the way some officers stiffened at her presence, their eyes following her as she passed. She could sense the tension building like a thick cloud hanging in the air. Reaching the captain's office, Williams closed the door behind them. Let me be honest with you, Lieutenant Thomas, he began, taking a seat behind his desk. There's been some concern from the team about having a new lieutenant, especially one with a reputation like yours. Rachel raised an eyebrow. A reputation for getting the job done? Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I've heard you're not afraid to challenge the status quo, to stand up against corruption. That's commendable, but not everyone here sees it that way. There's a certain culture in this precinct. It's not perfect, but it works. Some of the officers are worried you might disrupt that. Rachel finished for him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Exactly. Williams hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'm not saying it's right, but I want you to be prepared for some pushback. You're going to have to earn their trust. I've never shied away from a challenge, Captain, Rachel replied steadily. I'm here to do my job and do it well. I've dealt with resistance before, and I'll deal with it again if I have to. The captain studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. I hope you mean that. Later that day, Rachel decided to head back to her car to grab a few more things before settling in for the day. As she stepped outside, she noticed Officer Jack Carter standing by the parking lot entrance, watching her closely. His expression was unreadable, but his body language suggested tension. Catching his name tag, Officer Jack Carter, something about his demeanor put her on edge. She could see the suspicion in his eyes, a skepticism that wasn't just about her being new. Rachel tried to ignore it, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was about to happen. And she was right. The tension was building, and soon it would reach a boiling point. As she headed toward her unmarked police car, footsteps approached from behind. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw Carter walking toward her, a stern, almost predatory look in his eyes. "Hey you," he called out sharply. Rachel turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral but alert. "Yes, Officer Carter." Carter stopped a few feet away from her, his stance wide and authoritative. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, resting his hand near his utility belt, fingers tapping rhythmically against his sidearm. It wasn't drawn, but the implication was clear. Rachel kept her tone steady. "I'm getting some things from my car." Carter narrowed his eyes, clearly unsatisfied. "You got some ID on you?" Ignoring the fact that she was clearly in uniform, his tone was cautious but condescending, dripping with suspicion. Rachel took a slow breath. She knew this type, officers who saw her as a threat simply because of her race and rank. "I'm Lieutenant Rachel Thomas," she said, reaching for her badge. Holding it up for him to see, her expression remained composed. "I transferred here. I'm sure you've been informed." Carter took a step closer, peering at the badge as if expecting to see something fraudulent. His eyes flicked between her face and the badge, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This looks real nice, but I don't know you, and I don't trust what I don't know," he said, his voice tinged with barely concealed edge. Rachel felt the tension mounting. She knew she had to be careful with her words. "If you have any doubts, officer, you're welcome to call Captain Williams. He'll verify my identity," she said, keeping her tone professional. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but wasn't going to back down either. Carter stared at her for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing with every second. Instead of acknowledging her suggestion, he tilted his head and smirked. "You know, there've been a lot of reports lately about stolen cars in this area. You driving an unmarked vehicle like this kind of fits that description." Rachel's heart rate quickened, but outwardly, she remained calm. She knew where this was heading. "This is my assigned vehicle, Officer Carter. And I'd appreciate it if you treat me with the respect my position deserves," she replied, her voice firm but measured. Carter wasn't backing down. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car," he said, his hand now resting more firmly on his holstered gun. Other officers in the parking lot started to notice the growing tension and began to look over, exchanging curious glances but not intervening. Rachel's mind raced. She had just arrived at this precinct, and the last thing she wanted was a confrontation that would put her at odds with her new colleagues. But she also knew she couldn't show weakness in the face of blatant discrimination. "Is there a specific reason you're asking me to step out of my car?" she asked, her voice remaining even though her eyes were locked onto his. Carter's smirk faded, replaced by a hard, cold stare. "You're not complying with a direct order, Lieutenant." "I suggest you do as I say," he replied, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to stay calm and defuse the situation. "Officer Carter, I've given you my ID. I've identified myself as a lieutenant in this precinct. You have no grounds to detain me," she said firmly. Carter's patience seemed to snap. "You think just because you're wearing that badge, you're above the law," he spat, his voice rising. "Step out of the vehicle now." A small crowd had started to gather, both civilians and other officers. Rachel noticed their eyes on her, some filled with concern, others with anticipation. She knew she needed to be careful. One wrong move could lead to a situation spiraling out of control. Taking a breath, she considered her options. "I'm not stepping out without a valid reason," she replied, her tone still measured but leaving no room for doubt. Carter's face twisted with anger. "I said step out of the car," he shouted, his hand moving to unfasten the strap on his holster. The threat was clear now. He was ready to draw his weapon. The crowd around them gasped, and Rachel could see phones being raised, cameras rolling. Listening to Officer Carter, she tried to reason with him, her hands slowly raising to show she wasn't a threat. "I'm not resisting, but I'm also not going to comply with an unlawful order. Call Captain Williams. He'll clear this up." But Carter wasn't listening. His face flushed with a mix of anger and fear. His authority was being challenged, and he wasn't sure how to regain control. "Put the gun down, Carter," one of the other officers called out, stepping forward cautiously. "She's a lieutenant. Let's not make this worse." Rachel felt her pulse thundering in her ears. She knew this was a critical moment. One wrong move, and he might pull the trigger. Keeping her voice calm and steady, she said, "Officer Carter, this is your last chance to step back and de-escalate. I'm not your enemy, but you're making a big mistake." Just as it seemed Carter was about to make a rash decision, Captain Williams arrived, his face a mix of shock and fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he barked, looking between Rachel and Carter. Carter's eyes darted to the captain, his grip on the gun loosening slightly. "Captain, she's your new lieutenant," Carter stammered, putting the gun away reluctantly, his hand shaking. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Captain Williams led Rachel Thomas down a long corridor, his face set in a hard line. Rachel could feel the eyes of her new colleagues on her as they passed, whispers rippling through the room like an electric current. The news of the confrontation in the parking lot was already spreading, and it was clear that everyone had an opinion. Some were shocked, others seemed quietly pleased, but most wore expressions of uncertainty and discomfort. Rachel's mind was still reeling from what had just happened. She had experienced her share of hostility in her career, but having a gun drawn on her by a fellow officer at her own precinct was a new low. She felt a storm brewing inside her, anger, frustration, a sense of deep betrayal, but she knew she had to stay focused. She couldn't let her emotions get the best of her, not now. They reached the captain's office, and Williams opened the door, gesturing for Rachel to enter. She stepped inside, taking a seat in front of his desk. Williams closed the door firmly behind them and took a deep breath before sitting down. "Lieutenant Thomas, I want to start by saying that what just happened out there is completely unacceptable," he began, his voice measured but stern. "I apologize on behalf of this precinct. Officer Carter's behavior was out of line, and we will be addressing it." Rachel nodded, but her expression remained tense. "Captain, with all due respect, out of line doesn't even begin to cover it. He drew a weapon on me in front of civilians and other officers, and he did it because he refused to believe I belong here." Williams sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I understand your frustration, Lieutenant. Believe me, I do. But you have to understand that there's a culture here, a culture of racism, paranoia, lack of professionalism." Rachel interrupted, her eyes blazing. "Because that's what it looked like to me, and that's what it's going to look like to everyone who sees the video footage that's already circulating online." Williams winced slightly. "Look, Thomas, I'm not here to defend Carter's actions, but I need you to understand that he's not the only one. There's a lot of tension in this precinct. People are on edge, especially with everything that's been going on lately. That justifies threatening a fellow officer?" Rachel shot back. "You've got people here who are so blinded by their biases that they're willing to escalate a situation to the point of violence without a second thought. That's not tension, Captain. That's a problem." Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from frustration to resignation. "You're right," he admitted after a moment. "It is a problem, but it's a problem that's not going to be solved overnight. We need to handle this carefully." Rachel crossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. "I want an immediate investigation into Carter's conduct, and I want it to be transparent. If this is how he treats a superior officer, I can't imagine how he's treating civilians." The captain nodded slowly. "An investigation will be conducted. I'll see to it myself. But Lieutenant, I need you to understand that pushing too hard, too fast, could create more resistance. If you want to make changes here, you're going to need to play it smart. Rachel's eyes narrowed. She knew he was right, but it didn't make the situation any less infuriating. I'm not here to play games, Captain. I'm here to do my job and make sure this precinct is up to the standards the public expects from us. Williams held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. I respect that. I'll do what I can to support you, but you're going to have to earn the trust of the team. Rachel felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She knew she was walking into hostile territory, but she hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly. I'm not here to win a popularity contest, Captain. I'm here to lead. There was a knock on the door, and Sergeant Davis stepped in, his face a mixture of concern and urgency. Captain, Lieutenant, you both need to see this, he said, holding up his phone. The video from the parking lot was already going viral, news outlets picking it up. Rachel stood up, taking the phone from Davis and watching the shaky footage of Officer Carter drawing his gun on her, shouting at her to get out of the car. The audio was clear enough to capture the fear and disbelief in the voices of the onlookers and Rachel's own calm but firm responses. The video ended with Captain Williams arriving on the scene, ordering Carter to stand down. This is exactly what I was talking about, Rachel said, handing the phone back to Davis. This isn't just a precinct issue anymore. It's a public issue. Williams rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. All right, here's what we're going to do. Davis, I want a statement prepared for the press. We need to get ahead of this, make it clear that we're taking this incident seriously, and that an internal investigation is underway. Rachel nodded, but she wasn't satisfied. And what about Carter? What's happening with him right now? Davis glanced at Williams before responding. He's been pulled off duty for the time being. He's in the locker room cooling off. Rachel's jaw tightened. Cooling off? That's it. Williams held up a hand. Lieutenant, I know you're angry, but we have to follow protocol. We can't just throw him under the bus without due process. I promise you, there will be consequences. Rachel took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She knew there was a right way to handle this, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. Fine, but I want to be kept in the loop every step of the way. Agreed, Williams said, standing up. Now, let's get back out there and show the team that we're all on the same side. We don't need any more division. The tension in the precinct was palpable. Every officer seemed to be on edge, eyes darting toward Rachel whenever she passed. It was clear that the lines were being drawn, and the atmosphere was charged with an unspoken electricity. The incident in the parking lot had polarized the precinct, creating a rift that was only growing deeper by the hour. Some officers showed signs of support, a nod here, a reassuring glance there. Others, however, had their own quiet conversations, casting wary looks in Rachel's direction. Their loyalty to Carter was evident in their body language. Rachel knew the situation was delicate. She had made it clear to Captain Williams that she would not tolerate any form of discrimination or unprofessional behavior. The video of Officer Carter drawing his weapon on her had gone viral, and the pressure was mounting on the precinct to take definitive action. But as she moved through the precinct halls, she could feel the tension tightening around her like a noose. She couldn't allow herself to be intimidated. She had a job to do, and she intended to do it well. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Captain Williams. Need to meet. Urgent. Rachel's brow furrowed as she quickly turned on her heel and headed toward his office, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Williams was already standing outside his office, talking to Sergeant Davis. Both men looked concerned, their faces grim as Rachel approached. Lieutenant Thomas, Williams said, his tone serious. We've got a situation developing. Carter's not taking this well. He's refusing to cooperate with the investigation and has been stirring up trouble among the other officers. Rachel's eyes narrowed. What kind of trouble? Davis spoke up, his voice low. He's been rallying some of the younger guys, telling them that you're here to shake things up, make them look bad. They're angry and talking about pushing back. Rachel crossed her arms, her expression hardening. So, they're banding together to resist accountability? That's exactly what we don't need right now. Williams nodded, agreeing. It's getting worse. Carter's been in the locker room all morning, and I just got word that he's refusing to leave. Says he's not going to be pushed around by anyone, especially not by you. Rachel felt a cold knot form in her stomach. What do you want me to do, Captain? Williams hesitated. I'd like you to stay clear for now. Let me and Davis handle it, but I thought you should know what's happening. It's a powder keg in there, and Carter's got a few matches to strike. Before Williams could respond further, a loud commotion erupted from down the hallway, coming from the direction of the locker room. Raised voices echoed through the halls, and Rachel instantly recognized Carter's angry shout. Without another word, she turned and headed in that direction, with Williams and Davis following close behind. The tension in the precinct was palpable. Every officer seemed to be on edge, eyes darting toward Rachel whenever she passed. It was clear that the lines were being drawn, and the atmosphere was charged with an unspoken electricity. The incident in the parking lot had polarized the precinct, creating a rift that was only growing deeper by the hour. Some officers showed signs of support, a nod here, a reassuring glance there. Others, however, had their own quiet conversations, casting wary looks in Rachel's direction. Their loyalty to Carter was evident in their body language. Rachel knew the situation was delicate. She had made it clear to Captain Williams that she would not tolerate any form of discrimination or unprofessional behavior. The video of Officer Carter drawing his weapon on her had gone viral, and the pressure was mounting on the precinct to take definitive action. But as she moved through the precinct halls, she could feel the tension tightening around her like a noose. She couldn't allow herself to be intimidated. She had a job to do, and she intended to do it well. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Captain Williams. Need to meet. Urgent. Rachel's brow furrowed as she quickly turned on her heel and headed toward his office, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Williams was already standing outside his office, talking to Sergeant Davis. Both men looked concerned, their faces grim as Rachel approached. Lieutenant Thomas, Williams said, his tone serious. We've got a situation developing. Carter's not taking this well. He's refusing to cooperate with the investigation and has been stirring up trouble among the other officers. Rachel's eyes narrowed. What kind of trouble? Davis spoke up, his voice low. He's been rallying some of the younger guys, telling them that you're here to shake things up, make them look bad. They're angry and talking about pushing back. Rachel crossed her arms, her expression hardening. So, they're banding together to resist accountability? That's exactly what we don't need right now. Williams nodded, agreeing. It's getting worse. Carter's been in the locker room all morning, and I just got word that he's refusing to leave. Says he's not going to be pushed around by anyone, especially not by you. Rachel felt a cold knot form in her stomach. What do you want me to do, Captain? Williams hesitated. I'd like you to stay clear for now. Let me and Davis handle it, but I thought you should know what's happening. It's a powder keg in there, and Carter's got a few matches to strike. Before Williams could respond further, a loud commotion erupted from down the hallway, coming from the direction of the locker room. Raised voices echoed through the halls, and Rachel instantly recognized Carter's angry shout. Without another word, she turned and headed in that direction, with Williams and Davis following close behind. As they reached the locker room, Rachel saw several officers gathered outside, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Some were peeking inside, whispering to each other. She pushed away through the crowd and stepped inside, her eyes immediately locking onto Carter. He was standing in the middle of the room, his face flushed with rage, his hands balled into fists. Several of the younger officers were standing around him, looking nervous and uncertain. The atmosphere was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. "Carter!" Rachel called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "That's enough. Stand down and come with me." Carter whipped around to face her, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you can just order me around? You think you can walk in here and act like you're in charge of everything?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the metal lockers. Rachel remained calm, but her heart was pounding. She knew this could get out of hand very quickly. "I am in charge, Carter. I'm your superior officer, and I'm telling you to stand down," she said firmly. But Carter wasn't listening. He was too far gone, consumed by his anger and resentment. "You don't belong here," he yelled, his voice trembling. "You and your high and mighty attitude, thinking you're better than everyone else. You're not welcome here." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "This isn't about me, Carter. It's about your inability to follow orders and show respect. Now stand down, or there will be consequences." Carter's face twisted with rage, and in a split second, his hand shot to his holster. "I'm not taking orders from you," he screamed, pulling his gun out and aiming it directly at Rachel. The room went deadly silent. The only sound was the quick and labored breathing of the officers around them. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" Davis shouted, stepping forward, but Rachel held up a hand to stop him. Rachel felt a cold wave of fear wash over her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She raised her hand slowly, her eyes never leaving Carter's. "Carter, put the gun down. You don't want to do this." But Carter's eyes were wild, his hand shaking as he kept the gun trained on her. "I'm done being pushed around by you. I'm done with all of this," he shouted, his voice breaking. Rachel knew she had to de-escalate the situation quickly. She could see the fear and desperation in his eyes. He wasn't thinking straight. "Listen to me, Carter. You're angry. I get that. But pulling that trigger isn't going to solve anything. It's only going to make things worse for you, for me, for everyone here." Carter's grip on the gun tightened, his knuckles white. "You think you can just come in here and change everything? I've been here for years, and I'm not going to let you ruin everything I've worked for." Rachel took a slow, careful step closer, her hand still raised. "I'm not here to ruin anything, Carter. I'm here to make this place better for all of us. But this isn't the way to handle it. Put the gun down, and we'll talk. We can figure this out." Carter wasn't listening. He was breathing heavily, his face a mask of rage and fear. "I said I'm done," he screamed, his finger twitching on the trigger. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the tension in the room like a physical force pressing down on her. She knew she had only seconds to act. Suddenly, Carter's expression changed. His eyes widened, and he seemed to snap back to reality, realizing what he was about to do. His hand trembled, the gun wavering. But before he could fully lower it, one of the younger officers nearby panicked and moved to grab his arm. "Stop!" Rachel yelled, but it was too late. Carter jerked his arm away, and in the chaos, the gun went off. A deafening crack filled the room, and everything seemed to freeze for a split second. Rachel thought she had been hit, but then she realized she was still standing, still breathing. The bullet had hit the wall behind her, missing her by mere inches. The room erupted into chaos. Several officers rushed forward, tackling Carter to the ground and disarming him. Others were shouting, trying to get control of the situation. Rachel stood there, her heart racing, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Get him out of here," she ordered, her voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Put him in a holding cell until we figure this out." As Carter was dragged away, still shouting incoherently, Rachel turned to the other officers. "Everyone back to your posts. This is over." The room began to clear, but Rachel could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over her. She knew this was far from over. The situation had escalated beyond anything she had anticipated, and now there would be serious consequences. The precinct was in chaos. The sound of Officer Carter's gunshots still echoed in the minds of everyone present, leaving an indelible mark on the day. Rachel Thomas stood in the center of the locker room, her heart pounding, her mind sharp. The officers who had just subdued Carter were now dragging him out, his face a mask of anger and confusion. The room buzzed with tension as officers exchanged shocked glances and whispered among themselves. Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the entire precinct, the culture that had allowed someone like Carter to feel emboldened enough to pull a gun on his superior officer. The gravity of the situation was setting in, and she knew she had to act swiftly to contain it. Captain Williams entered the locker room, flanked by two senior officers. His face was pale, his jaw set in a grim line. He glanced around, taking in the scene, and his eyes locked onto Rachel. "Lieutenant Thomas," he said, his voice barely masking the stress. "I need you in my office now." Rachel nodded, keeping her composure. She turned to Sergeant Davis, who was still watching Carter being taken away. "Davis, make sure he's secured and get a medical check on him. I want a full report by the end of the day," she ordered. "Yes, ma'am," Davis replied, already moving to carry out her instructions. Rachel followed Williams back to his office, her mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. As she walked through the precinct, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She didn't flinch. She kept her head high, her stride purposeful. She was the lieutenant here, and she needed to show strength even in the face of this chaos. Inside Williams's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Williams closed the door behind them and immediately turned to face her. "Rachel, what the hell just happened back there?" he demanded, his voice barely controlled. Rachel met his gaze, her own eyes hard with resolve. "What happened is that an officer fueled by prejudice and unchecked anger pulled a gun on me, and it nearly turned deadly." Williams ran a hand over his face, clearly overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. "This is going to blow up in our faces, Lieutenant. The press is already all over the video from the parking lot. Now it's only a matter of time before they're banging on our doors demanding answers." Rachel nodded. "Good. Let them demand answers. This precinct has been festering with this kind of behavior for too long. If we don't address it now, it's only going to get worse." Williams leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I'm with you, Rachel, but we have to be smart about this. An internal investigation is mandatory, and we'll cooperate fully, but we also need to control the narrative. We can't afford for this to spiral out of control." Rachel crossed her arms, her expression stern. "What's the plan then? Are we going to start with a press conference?" Williams nodded. "We need to get out in front of this, make it clear that we're taking this incident seriously, and that there will be accountability. I want you to be there alongside me. You need to speak directly to the public. They need to hear from you." Rachel considered this for a moment. She knew that going public would mean putting herself even more in the spotlight, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. "Be there, but I want to make sure that this isn't just lip service. There needs to be real action behind our words." Williams nodded. "Agreed. Carter will be suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of the investigation, and we're going to implement new training protocols focused on de-escalation and bias. This incident is proof that we need it. Rachel felt a surge of determination. We should also bring in an external agency to conduct an independent review. We need to show that we're serious about transparency. Williams hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. All right. I'll make the call, but I want you to be prepared for the backlash. Not everyone here is going to be happy about that. Rachel knew he was right. She could already see the lines being drawn, the camps forming. But she also knew that change wouldn't come easy. It never did. I'm ready, she said. Let's do this. The press conference was scheduled for that afternoon. The precinct's lobby was packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones at the ready. The air was thick with anticipation. Rachel stood off to the side, watching as the room filled. She could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her, but she remained composed. This was her chance to speak truth to power, to call out the deep-seated issues that had led to this point. Captain Williams approached her, adjusting his tie nervously. "You ready for this?" he asked. Rachel nodded. More than ready. Williams stepped up to the podium first, clearing his throat as the room quieted down. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. As you all know, there was an incident at this precinct earlier today involving one of our officers. We are here to provide a statement and to answer any questions you may have." The room was silent, every reporter's eyes trained on him. Williams continued. "First and foremost, let me be clear. The actions of Officer Jack Carter were unacceptable and do not reflect the values of this precinct or the police department as a whole. An internal investigation has been launched, and Officer Carter has been suspended pending the outcome of that investigation." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and hands shot up with questions. Williams held up a hand. "Before we take questions, I want to introduce Lieutenant Rachel Thomas. She is the new lieutenant of this precinct and was the target of this unwarranted aggression. She has a few words she'd like to say." Rachel took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The flash of cameras nearly blinded her, but she stood tall, her expression resolute. "Thank you, Captain," she began, her voice steady. "As many of you have seen from the footage circulating online, I was the victim of a potentially deadly confrontation with Officer Carter. This was not just an isolated incident. It was a manifestation of a much deeper issue within our police force." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, the tension thick. "I came to this precinct to serve and protect this community, to uphold the law, and ensure justice is applied equally to everyone, including within our own ranks. What happened today shows that we still have a long way to go. We need real change, not just talk, not just temporary measures, but systemic change that addresses the root causes of bias, prejudice, and aggression." Rachel could see the reporters hanging on her every word. She knew she was walking a fine line, but she wasn't going to back down. "That is why I am calling for an independent external investigation into this precinct's practices and culture. We need transparency and accountability, not just for the public's trust, but for the integrity of every officer who wears this badge and serves this community." There was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted into questions. Rachel held up a hand. "I'll take questions now, but know this, I am committed to seeing this through. We owe it to ourselves and to the people we serve." The aftermath of the press conference was intense. The media response was swift, with headlines ranging from support for Rachel's stance to criticism of the precinct's handling of the situation. Within hours, news outlets were running segments on the culture of policing, bias training, and the need for reform. Rachel's phone buzzed constantly with messages, some supportive, others less so. Back in the precinct, things were even more tense. Rachel could feel the divide growing deeper. Some officers resented her for bringing in an external review, while others quietly thanked her for standing up. She knew she had allies, but she also knew that she was in for a long battle. Sergeant Davis approached her later that day, his expression grim. "Lieutenant, we've got a problem," he said. "A few of the officers are talking about walking out, saying they won't work under you if this investigation goes forward." Rachel nodded. She had expected this. "Let them," she said. "If they're not willing to be part of a better, more accountable force, then they don't belong here." Davis sighed. "I'm with you, Rachel, but it's going to get ugly." Rachel met his gaze. "I know, but I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to do what's right." Later that evening, after most of the reporters had left and the precinct had quieted down, Rachel sat in her office staring at the stack of reports and paperwork piling up on her desk. She knew she was fighting an uphill battle, but she wasn't afraid of the challenge. She had faced tougher odds before, and she knew that change never came easy. There was a knock on her door, and Captain Williams entered, looking exhausted. "Long day," he said, taking a seat across from her. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, and it's only going to get longer." Williams rubbed his eyes. "You sure you're ready for this, Rachel? This isn't going to end anytime soon." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression resolute. "I'm sure, Captain. I've spent my entire career fighting for what's right. I'm not stopping now." Williams gave her a tired smile. "All right, then. Let's get to work. We've got a lot ahead of us, but if anyone can lead this precinct through it, it's you." The days following the meeting with the Independent Review Board were a whirlwind of activity. The precinct was buzzing with discussions about the new reforms, and while some officers grumbled, others began to show signs of openness to change. Rachel Thomas stood at the forefront, leading by example and ensuring that every officer understood the importance of these initiatives. Dr. Eleanor Hayes had returned weeks later to assess the progress, and she was visibly impressed. Walking through the precinct, she noted the changes in demeanor and attitude among the officers. "Lieutenant Thomas," she said during a private meeting, "you've done remarkable work here. This isn't just about implementing policies. It's about fostering a culture of accountability and respect." Rachel nodded, her expression resolute. "We still have a long way to go, but I believe we're heading in the right direction. These changes won't happen overnight, but they will happen if we stay committed." Hayes smiled approvingly. "That kind of determination is what this profession needs more of. Keep pushing forward, Lieutenant." As months passed, the transformation within the precinct became increasingly evident. Mandatory bias training sessions were now part of the regular schedule, and officers who once resisted them began to see their value. The de-escalation protocols introduced by Rachel proved effective in several high-pressure situations, earning her further respect from her colleagues. Even Connor, one of Carter's staunchest allies, started showing signs of compliance, though his resistance remained palpable. One afternoon, as Rachel reviewed reports in her office, there was a knock on the door. She looked up to find Officer Martinez standing there, his face hesitant but determined. "Lieutenant, can I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. "Of course, Martinez. What's on your mind?" Rachel replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. He glanced around briefly before speaking. "I wasn't sure about all this at first, the training, the oversight committee, but after seeing how you handle things, I think you're right. We needed this." His voice carried a note of vulnerability, something Rachel hadn't expected. She smiled warmly. "I appreciate that, Martinez. It takes courage to admit when you need to grow. And remember, we're stronger together." Word spread quickly among the younger officers about Martinez's newfound support for the reforms, encouraging others to follow suit. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. While older officers like Connor continued to pose challenges, Rachel knew she couldn't force change overnight. Instead, she focused on building relationships, addressing concerns individually, and reinforcing the message that accountability benefits everyone. Months turned into a year, and the precinct underwent significant evolution. Complaints against officers dropped dramatically, community relations improved, and morale among the ranks stabilized. Captain Williams often praised Rachel's leadership during staff meetings, crediting her vision and perseverance for turning the precinct around. But perhaps the most rewarding moment came when Dr. Hayes returned for another evaluation. After touring the facility and speaking with numerous officers, she addressed Rachel privately. "Lieutenant Thomas, what you've accomplished here is extraordinary. You've set an example not just for this precinct, but for law enforcement agencies nationwide." Rachel felt a wave of pride mixed with humility. "It hasn't been easy, and there's still much work to do, but I'm proud of what we've achieved so far. None of it would have been possible without the support of my team." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. True leadership isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about inspiring others to rise to the occasion. You've done exactly that. With renewed confidence, Rachel looked toward the future. Challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, but she was ready. The battle for meaningful change wasn't over, but she had proven that progress was possible, even in the face of adversity. As long as she remained steadfast in her commitment to justice, integrity, and equality, she knew she could continue making a difference, not just for her precinct, but for the entire policing system. And so, Lieutenant Rachel Thomas pressed onward, leading with purpose and leaving an indelible mark on those fortunate enough to serve alongside her.
And that's where our story ends. What did you think of this story? Share your emotions in the comments below. We'd love to know what you remember most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And if you are in the mood for another exciting story, check out our next video. It's waiting for you. Until then, stay curious, get inspired, and keep exploring the stories that make life extraordinary. See you in the next one.